Hello, my YouTube family. Welcome back to Crime Whisper. If you clicked on this video to fall asleep, you're in the right place. If you enjoy this story, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time you usually watch these videos. Now, let's dive into our first story. Story 1. The most dangerous manipulators are often the smoothest talkers. They're persuasive, charismatic, and can lull a person's guard to sleep, then bend that person to their will. Being in a relationship with someone like that can threaten both mental and physical safety. Manipulators don't hunt the weak. They hunt the vibrant people full of life, ambition, and energy. Even the smartest, most independent people can be drawn in and slowly broken down until they become compliant. Silent shadows of themselves. The press nicknamed the Australian Tinder stalker preyed on young, successful women. He wooed them with charm, intelligence, and looks, then turned their lives into nightmares. His name was Paul Lambert. Attractive, intelligent, and dangerously persuasive, Paul stalked his victims with an obsession that escalated into threats, violence, and finally, an attempt that only a bullet stopped. Early life of Paul Lambert. Paul, full name Paul Lambert Scales, was born on August 10, 1980. In Brisbane, Queensland. He was the younger of two children, born to Margaret and Oliver Scales, and grew up with an older sister, Dorothy. His parents divorced when he was under 5. His father largely disappeared from day-to-day life, remaining a presence only for holidays and occasional phone calls, though he did offer some financial support. Oliver later remarried and had 2 more children. After that, he visited Paul and Dorothy. Rarely. Paul felt abandoned and wounded by his father's absence, and he carried that hurt into childhood. By early adolescence, Paul's behavior became a serious problem. He was impulsive, aggressive, and resistant to authority. Difficult for both his mother and his teachers to manage. His mother sought professional help. A child psychologist diagnosed him with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. At the time, the psychologist attributed much of his behavior to the trauma of his parents' divorce, predicting he might outgrow it. But his issues deepened. By age 10, he was increasingly uncontrollable. A psychiatrist later expanded his diagnoses to include bipolar disorder and signs of dissociative identity disorder, sometimes called multiple personality disorder, a condition where a person's identity fragments and distinct personality states appear. He was prescribed medication and was supposed to take it under his mother's supervision. Getting him to comply proved difficult. Paul insisted he was fine and refused to take his meds while still a child. However, his mother's persistence and supervision kept things manageable for a while. Paul's mental health struggles didn't stop him from doing well academically. He excelled in school, particularly at science and mathematics, and teachers expected a bright future. He went on to earn a master's degree in economics and finance at a respected Australian university, and later landed a job at a major company's Sydney headquarters, eventually rising to head the finance department. Socially and romantically, Paul was striking from a young age. He had strong masculine features, expressive eyes, and a commanding build. He was popular, sociable, and effortlessly charming. The life of the party. Oddly, his mental health issues seemed to amplify his charisma. People called him reliable and kind. When a coworker's child fell ill, Paul was the one to organize and fundraise to help the family. He made friends easily and seemed to have it all, but his relationships rarely lasted. Paul's romances were intense and brief. After a few months, his darker side emerged: stalking, manipulation, lies, veiled threats, and an ability to make a partner feel trapped. He targeted very attractive women who matched his own aesthetic ideals. He was an expert manipulator, skilled at fabricating sob stories, claiming terminal illnesses for himself or loved ones to wring sympathy and guilt from those who tried to leave him. Only his mother and sister really knew the truth about him. As an adult, he rejected treatment and refused psychiatric care instead of help. He turned to coercion, blackmail, threats, and the most effective weapon of all, the threat of suicide between 2002 and 2016. Paul accumulated 6 restraining orders from 6 different ex-girlfriends. He stalked them relentlessly, poisoned their lives, and pushed some to the edge of sanity. In one case, he even followed a victim to another country. He was deported and banned from re-entering after she involved the police now. Let's move step by step. First love, while at university. Paul met. Paul's first serious relationship began in university with a girl named Samantha at first. Their love seemed innocent, young and passionate, but it didn't take long for Paul's controlling nature to surface. He began dictating her every move, isolating her, manipulating her, and eroding her confidence piece by piece. When they graduated, life naturally pulled them apart. Samantha stayed in Queensland, while Paul moved to Sydney to chase his career ambitions. Despite the toxic end to their romance, they continued to stay in touch. Phone calls, occasional messages, and friendly social media interactions. Samantha didn't know about Paul's new relationships. From time to time, he messaged her, saying he still missed her, that no one compared to her, and that he wanted another chance. It was manipulation, but Samantha, remembering their early love, believed he might have changed. Attempt to start a family in January 2014. Nearly 10 years after their breakup, Paul and Samantha rekindled their relationship within a month. He proposed, and she said yes. They married on March 2, 2014, but only a few weeks after the wedding, Paul's true nature returned. His temper became uncontrollable. Even the smallest disagreements triggered explosive reactions. He emotionally pressured Samantha, tried to dominate her, and when words failed, he turned violent when Samantha finally threatened to leave. Paul begged for another chance. He promised to seek professional help, claiming he would change, but it was only another manipulation tactic. 6 months into their marriage, the situation became unbearable. Samantha asked for a divorce once again. Paul promised therapy, then convinced her to take a vacation to work on their relationship. In September 2014, they flew to the United States. Paul insisted on visiting Florida, though Samantha preferred Hawaii. As always, she gave in on the beaches of Florida's Atlantic coast. They even renewed their vows, but the trip couldn't fix their broken marriage obsession in Florida. After returning to Australia, Paul became obsessed with the idea of moving to Florida permanently. Samantha refused. She wanted to end the marriage and rebuild her life. Paul wouldn't hear of it. In a sudden, irrational move, he quit his high-paying job, packed up his life, and flew to Florida, leaving Samantha behind. She pushed forward with the divorce, but Paul ignored all legal notices with the money he'd saved. He settled comfortably in the U.S. He rented a luxurious apartment, hit the gym daily, dressed impeccably, and easily drew attention wherever he went. But he wasn't looking for love. He was hunting for control. The unfinished divorce. Paul soon created profiles on several dating platforms, uploading his best photos. His inbox flooded with messages from women captivated by his looks and confidence. But he was selective, until one profile caught his eye. Brittany Ann Kill, a 32-year-old local news anchor with movie star beauty. Paul messaged her first, and within a day, they met for dinner. He took her to one of the city's finest restaurants, charming her with polished manners, intelligence, and endless compliments. Brittany was swept off her feet. She told her best friend she might have met the perfect man, but Paul didn't see Brittany as a partner. He saw her as a prize, a symbol of success behind his charming facade. His obsession was already forming when he told Brittany he needed to return to Australia for business. It was a cover story in truth. He was desperate to finalize his divorce so he could marry her back in Australia. Samantha was startled by his sudden desire to end their marriage, especially after he had fought so hard to keep her before. Still, she agreed by early 2015, though the divorce wasn't yet legally finalized. Paul flew back to Florida, unwilling to stay away from his new target, Beauty and the Beast. Not long after returning, Brittany accidentally discovered that Paul's trip to Australia wasn't for business. It was for his unfinished marriage. Shocked and guilt-ridden, she considered breaking things off. But Paul spun a story of heartbreak, claiming he and his wife had long separated and were ending things amicably. He said he just wanted to move on and find real love. Brittany forgave him within a week. They moved in together. She gave Paul a 3-month trial, time to see if their relationship would work, but within a month, his mask slipped. Paul's behavior turned unpredictable. He controlled who she saw, where she went, and what she wore. He monitored her phone, questioned her constantly, and treated her like property. His mood swung between charming affection and explosive rage. It was as if multiple personalities lived inside him, each more unstable than the last. Realizing the danger, Brittany tried to leave, but Paul turned on the guilt, reminding her of the sacrifices he had made, that he'd left his job, his home, and his country for her. "You're destroying my life," he said, manipulating her once again. Still, Brittany stood firm. She packed her belongings and moved out, determined to end the nightmare before it consumed her. The stalking of Brittany. After Brittany moved out, hoping to escape Paul's unstable behavior, she thought she could finally breathe, but the nightmare had only begun. Paul started stalking her relentlessly. He sent hundreds of messages every single day, called from different numbers, flooded her email, and even followed her in person. The tone of his messages swung wildly. One moment he was declaring undying love. The next he was threatening, or worse, harm toward Hera. Few weeks later, he changed tactics. One night, he called Brittany. His voice trembling, he told her his father had just died, and he had no one else to talk to in the United States. Brittany, kind-hearted and empathetic, couldn't imagine someone lying about something so painful against her better judgment. She agreed to meet him, just to offer comfort. That's exactly what Paul wanted. By playing on her sympathy, he managed to slip back into her life, pretending to be the same charming man she once fell for. But it didn't last long. His aggression quickly resurfaced. His moods grew darker and his actions more erratic, frightening her all over again. When Brittany tried to break things off once more, Paul threatened to kill himself, claiming he couldn't survive another heartbreak. Terrified and unsure what to do, Brittany urged him to see a psychiatrist, but Paul had another lie ready. He said he was dying from an inoperable brain tumor, claiming his violent outbursts were symptoms of his illness. He cried, swearing he didn't have much time left, and begged her not to leave him while he was still alive. Brittany, caught between fear and guilt, stayed in touch, a decision that turned her life into a waking nightmare for the next 6 weeks. Paul tormented her constantly. He showed up at her work, lurked outside her home, and bombarded her with messages day and night. Brittany stopped sleeping, suffered panic attacks, and her performance at work began to crumble. Her once bright career as a TV anchor was hanging by a thread. Restraining order and desperate for safety, Brittany ran away. She hid at a friend's house, hoping Paul wouldn't find her, but he did this time. He resorted to blackmail, threatening to leak her private photos and an intimate video he had secretly recorded. That was the final straw. Brittany went to the police and reported everything. She even told Paul directly that she had filed charges against him. In July 2015, a court issued a restraining order, banning Paul from approaching, contacting, or communicating with her in any form, but he ignored it. He continued stalking, sending threats, and following her around. By October 2015, the authorities had had enough. Paul Lambert, still known legally as Paul Scales, was deported from the United States and banned from re-entry. Brittany finally breathed a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare was over. Returned to Australia. Back in Australia, Paul decided to reinvent himself. He changed his surname from Scales to Lambert, adopting his mother's maiden name to hide his criminal record. Then, unbelievably, he turned his attention back to his ex-wife, Samantha, the woman he had once terrorized. When Samantha learned he was back in the country, she was horrified. She immediately went to the police, pleading for protection and asking the court to finalize her long-delayed divorce as soon as possible. The first attempted murdering, February 2016. Paul called Samantha and told her he was finally ready to grant her a divorce. He suggested they meet a lawyer together to settle the final paperwork against her instincts and hoping to end this nightmare once and for all. Samantha agreed when he arrived to pick her up. Everything seemed normal, but once they were on the road, his tone shifted. Paul begged her to change her mind, to give their marriage another chance. When she refused, his voice turned cold. He threatened to crash the car and kill them both then. In a terrifying moment, he pressed the accelerator, speeding straight toward an oncoming truck. Samantha grabbed the steering wheel just in time, veering them off the road. Paul then began beating her inside the car, but she managed to escape and screamed for help. Samantha went straight to the police. Paul was charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder, and found guilty. On all counts, he received a 10-month prison sentence. His marriage was officially dissolved, and he was forbidden from ever contacting Samantha again, but justice was short-lived. Just 1 month later, Paul was released on parole, placed under supervision for 1 year. Broken system. He moved to another state, rented a small house, and found work without notifying the authorities to appear compliant. He flew back regularly to check in with his parole officer. He was also required to see a psychiatrist, who quickly realized the depth of Paul's psychological issues. He was prescribed strong medication, but, as always, he refused to take it. After completing the minimum court-ordered sessions, he stopped treatment altogether, and then history repeated itself. New victim almost immediately after his release. Paul created a new profile on a dating city bean, sitting by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, grading his students' notebooks, when he heard the first deep rumble, low and distant, like thunder buried beneath the ground. Within minutes, the sound grew into a roar that shook the walls of his home. Emmanuel rushed outside and saw what looked like a moving wall of darkness racing down the hillside. It wasn't rain or shadow, it was the mountain itself, collapsing in slow, unstoppable motion. He screamed for his wife and children, pulling them out into the night just as their roof caved in mud and water surged through the village, crushing everything in their path. Huts disappeared beneath torrents of soil. Trees snapped like matchsticks, and cries for help were swallowed by the sound of destruction. By dawn, what had once been a lively community was unrecognizable. The river that had sustained their crops now ran thick and brown with debris. Dozens of families were missing, their homes buried under layers of earth. The survivors, covered in mud and trembling with exhaustion, gathered on a patch of higher ground, staring silently at the wasteland below. In the following weeks, the full scale of the tragedy unfolded. Hundreds of acres of rainforest were gone, entire ecosystems erased in a matter of hours. Roads were destroyed, isolating villages from aid. Relief workers spoke of bodies found miles from where they had lived, carried away by the relentless flow of mud. Scientists later said it was one of the worst environmental disasters in Burundi's history, a deadly combination of deforestation, unstable soil, and unprecedented rainfall. But for people like Emmanuel, the explanations didn't matter. What haunted them was not the science, but the silence that followed, the silence of a forest that had once been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, now replaced by emptiness. 7 years later, Emmanuel said that when the rains came, he could still hear it, the echo of that night, the roar of the mountain falling, and the voices of those who never woke again. Promises were slow to materialize, supplies dwindled, funds disappeared into bureaucratic voids, and resentment began to brew among the displaced. Some communities accused local leaders of hoarding aid, while others turned on those believed to have collaborated with illegal loggers. Old tribal and regional tensions, long dormant, began to resurface under the strain of hunger and grief. Emmanuel watched this growing unrest with a weary heart. What had started as a tragedy born of nature was now deepening into one born of mistrust and neglect. The once tight-knit villages were fracturing, their unity dissolving like the soil that had slipped away at night. He would sit outside the tent he shared with his family, staring at the distant outlines of the deforested hills, their slopes stripped bare under the moonlight still. He refused to surrender to despair. Alongside other teachers, he began organizing small meetings, encouraging the survivors to work together to plant new trees, to rebuild schools, to remind the children that even after the earth falls, people can stand again slowly. Tiny green shoots began to dot the muddy wasteland. Each sapling was a fragile act of defiance, a whisper of life against the silence that had followed the storm. By the end of the year, the refugee camps had started to thin. Some families returned to their ruined villages, determined to start over. Others moved closer to the cities, seeking work and stability. The rainforest, though broken, began to show faint signs of renewal. Ferns sprouting along the riverbanks, birds cautiously returning to sing again. But the scars both on the land and in the hearts of the people remained. The elders continued to speak of the spirits who had once guarded the forest, saying they were watching to see if humanity had learned its lesson. Emmanuel wasn't sure about spirits, but he knew this. The land had spoken, and it had spoken through tragedy. Whether the people of Burundi would listen or repeat the same mistakes was a question only time could answer. And so, as another rainy season approached, Emmanuel stood beneath a young fig tree he and his students had planted months earlier. The air smelled of wet soil and rebirth. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the forest and the people could heal together. Following year, the tension that had once simmered quietly beneath Burundi's surface began to boil. What had started as scattered voices of frustration had now become a movement, one that united farmers, teachers, widows, and youth across the devastated regions. They called themselves Guardians of the Green, a name born out of grief, but fueled by hope. Their message was simple: the land belongs to the people, not to the corrupt or the careless. Clarice became the face of this movement. Her speeches, once confined to refugee camps, were now shared across the country through radio broadcasts and smuggled recordings. If they can destroy the forest, she said in one speech that would echo across the nation, then we can plant it again. But if they destroy our spirit, there will be no one left to plant. Her words inspired protests in towns near Bujumbura, drawing attention not only from national media, but from the international community that had once turned away. Emmanuel, ever the teacher, helped organize education drives in the camp, sessions on environmental care, corruption awareness, and civic rights. Rebuilding the forest starts with rebuilding the mind, he told his students beneath a tattered tarp roof. His lessons were simple but revolutionary. That knowledge and unity could be stronger than fear. But the government, feeling its control slip, responded with force. Soldiers were deployed to the camps under the pretext of maintaining order. Meetings were banned, and journalists investigating the misuse of recovery funds began to disappear. One morning, Clarice herself was taken from her tent by men in uniform. For days, no one knew where she had been taken until a local pastor reported seeing her in a hospital, bruised but alive, refusing to be silenced. They can beat me, she told Emmanuel when he visited her later, but they cannot bury the truth. The earth already tried that, and even it could not hold us down. Her defiance reignited the people's courage across the country. More villagers began planting trees symbolically, stubbornly, defiantly. Each sapling stood as both memorial and protest, and, slowly, quietly, the earth began to heal. Tiny green shoots emerged from the brown scars, stretching toward the sun like fragile promises. By mid-year, the movement's pressure forced the government to conduct an audit of the National Rainforest Recovery Project. What it uncovered shocked the nation. Millions in aid funds had been embezzled. High-ranking officials resigned. Some fled the country, and others faced charges. It wasn't justice in full, but it was a beginning. When the next rainy season arrived, the rain no longer brought only fear, it carried renewal. In Emmanuel's rebuilt school, children laughed again, their lessons now held under the growing canopy of young trees planted months before the wind that rustled through their leaves carried echoes of the past, of pain, of resilience, of voices that refused to be silenced, and, somewhere deep in the heart of the recovering rainforest, as birds returned to their nests and rivers ran clear once more, it was said that the forest spirits had grown quiet again, not in anger, but in peace, because at last, the people had remembered what it meant to listen. By September, the camps of the displaced had evolved into more than mere shelters. They had become the beating heart of a growing resistance. What the storm had shattered physically, the people were beginning to rebuild through unity, defiance, and the unwavering belief that their voices still mattered. Yet, this newfound solidarity was fragile, shadowed by the fear of retaliation from the very authorities who claimed to protect them in Buja. Whispers of corruption began to surface. Newspapers published damning reports suggesting that the National Rainforest Recovery Project was riddled with fraud, inflated contracts, missing aid money, and the replanting of non-native trees that served corporate interests rather than ecological restoration. The revelations ignited outrage, especially among the educated middle class who had previously watched from a safe distance. Suddenly, the suffering of rural villagers became not just a remote tragedy, but a national disgrace. Clarice, once an anonymous mother among thousands, was thrust into the public eye. Journalists sought her out. International reporters requested interviews, but visibility came at a price. Anonymous threats appeared beneath her tent flap. Strangers lingered at the camp's edge, watching, waiting. When asked if she was afraid, Clarice's answer never changed. What is fear compared to the silence of our dead? Emmanuel, still teaching children beneath torn tarps, became her quiet partner in resistance. He helped her write statements, translated testimonies for visiting aid workers, and encouraged his students to put their experiences into words. Your words are seeds, he told them. Plant them, and they will grow into something that cannot be washed away. Those fragile pages filled with trembling handwriting and memories of breaking trees, crying animals, and the smell of rain-soaked earth would later become vital evidence of what had truly been lost. As the pressure mounted, the government scrambled for control. A convoy of officials arrived in the disaster zone, their polished vehicles glinting mockingly against the mud-stained faces of the survivors. They gave speeches about progress, gesturing toward hillsides planted neatly with fast-growing eucalyptus, but the villagers saw the truth. The trees drained the soil and poisoned the water. They plant trees that kill the land, one farmer spat. This is not recovery, it is betrayal. Tension erupted when a group of desperate young men blocked the officials' convoy. Demanding justice, soldiers raised their rifles. The air thickened. One wrong move, and blood would be spilled before the first shot could be fired. Women ran forward, wailing, shielding the men with their bodies. Clarice stepped into the center of the standoff, arms raised high. If you must shoot, she cried, then shoot me first. But know this, the forest will remember. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, one soldier lowered his weapon. Another followed within moments. The convoy retreated. Humiliated, that day became legend. The day unarmed villagers stood against guns. The day dignity triumphed over fear. News of the confrontation spread quickly. International organizations demanded investigations. Foreign governments threatened to suspend aid unless transparency was restored. For the first time, the regime was cornered, not just by its people, but by the world. But the struggle was far from over. Disease tore through the camps, food grew scarce, despair stalked even the strongest. When Emmanuel's sister fell gravely ill, he nearly lost hope, until Clarice reminded him, even the smallest flame is still fire protected, and it can light the night. Then came December, and with it, the reckoning. A government whistleblower leaked documents proving massive embezzlement within the recovery project. The revelations exploded across headlines. Millions of dollars meant for relief had been funneled into offshore accounts. Protests erupted in Bujumbura. Students marched beside farmers. Chants of unity echoed through the streets under mounting pressure. Several ministers resigned. Investigations were promised, though few believed they'd reach the powerful yet. Something fundamental had changed. What began as a natural disaster had transformed into a national awakening by early 2012. Life in the camps was still harsh, but hope had taken root. Survivors formed councils to guide reforestation and aid distribution. International groups, chastened by exposure, began listening, planting native species, supporting local voices slowly, painfully. Green began to return. Small shoots rose from the ruined soil, fragile, defiant. Alive. Emmanuel's classroom was still a patch of dirt and wooden logs. One morning, a young girl asked softly, "Teacher, will the forest ever forgive us?" He paused, then smiled. "Forgiveness isn't given," he said. "It's grown. Each tree we plant, each truth we speak, each kindness we show, that is how the forest will forgive." Clarice, though still burdened by grief, became a symbol of hope. Her courage carried in headlines, documentaries, and whispered prayers. She called herself only a mother who wanted her children to live, but to her people, she was proof that even from ruin, strength can rise. And the rainforest, scarred, silent, but breathing again, began its slow recovery. Some species were gone forever. Some songs lost to time, yet life, relentless and stubborn, pushed through the cracks. One day, perhaps years later, the canopy would close again, different, imperfect, but alive, a living testament to the truth Clarice had spoken. The forest remembers, but it also forgoes. Documentaries and newsrooms far beyond Burundi's borders. Headlines called it the secret beneath the falls and Burundi's hidden chamber. What had begun as a geological curiosity had become a symbol of mistrust, of suppressed truth, and of a people's demand to know what lay buried beneath their land. By the end of that turbulent week, the government could no longer contain the frenzy under mounting pressure. Officials announced that a joint team of geologists and historians would conduct a public investigation, but few trusted their motives. Rumors persisted that military trucks had already transported fragments of the object under cover of darkness. Torn between curiosity and dread, returned to the falls. One evening, the area was deserted. Save for the distant echo of water pounding against rock, he stood near the spot where he had first felt the earth tremble. The cliff face was now scarred by drills and ropes, its mystery stripped bare, yet, as he listened, he thought he could still hear something beneath the roar of the water, a low hum, rhythmic and alive, as if the earth itself was remembering what it had once hidden in the villages. Elders warned that the spirits of Carrera had been angered. Cattle grew restless, and strange tremors shook the ground in the nights that followed. Some said it was geological aftershocks. Others whispered that whatever had slept beneath the falls had now awakened then. One morning, the soldiers were gone. The barricades had been removed. The investigation team disbanded. Without explanation, a terse radio statement declared that the object had been dismantled for safety reasons. No photographs were released, no samples were ever shown. The case was closed, but the people did not forget. The story of Carrera became a national legend, a cautionary tale told in markets and classrooms. Some believed the government had unearthed evidence of a colonial experiment. Others claimed it was something far older, a relic of civilizations erased by time, and a few, like Emmanuel, believed it was never meant to be found at all. Years later, when the rains returned and the falls roared once more in their full glory, visitors said the mist sometimes carried a strange shimmer at dusk, bluish faint, pulsing like a heartbeat. The guides no longer spoke openly about the buried object, but when tourists asked, Emmanuel would only smile faintly and say, "Some secrets belong to the water. The more you chase them, the deeper they drown." And with that, the legend of Carrera lived on, not in official records or archives, but in whispers carried by the spray, in the echo of the falls, and in the hearts of those who remembered the day the earth itself spoke Raud's chants. Journalists were forced back, cameras were confiscated within hours. Carrera vanished behind a wall of soldiers in silence. No one was allowed within miles of the site that night. Burundi held its breath. Radio stations played only government bulletins urging calm, while foreign correspondents reported being barred from entry. Villagers near the falls claimed they could still hear the strange hum, long after the rumble had faded, deep, rhythmic, and unsettling, like something stirring beneath the earth. By dawn, rumors flooded the airwaves. Some said the entire engineering team had disappeared, their names erased from official records. Others whispered that the government had unearthed something it couldn't explain or couldn't control. Foreign media speculated wildly. Ancient technology, a buried craft, a forgotten colonial experiment. Every theory only deepened the mystery. Emmanuel could no longer stay silent. He knew what he had felt, what he had heard, and what the people deserved to know. He traveled to Buj, meeting with journalists and activists who still dared to investigate, but he found fear everywhere. Editors hesitated to print his account. Phones went dead mid-call. Once friendly officials refused to meet his eyes. Then, one night, a stranger came to his door, a soldier, young and shaken. Still in uniform, he handed Emmanuel a folded envelope before disappearing into the darkness inside. Taken in low light, showing the hollow cavity behind the metallic wall. One image, blurred but unmistakable, revealed what looked like a circular hatch covered in engraved patterned symbols, unlike any known writing. Another showed faint blue light glowing from within the chamber. Manuel's hands trembled as he studied them. Whatever the government had found, it was not a pipeline. It was not natural. It was something made. He wanted to reveal the photos, to tell the world, but he knew the cost. Within days, plainclothes agents began appearing near his house. Friends warned him to flee. Still, he hesitated. The falls were part of his soul. How could he run from what he had sworn to protect? Then, without warning, everything changed again. 3 days after the incident, a sudden military evacuation order cleared all villages. Within a 10-kilometer radius of Carrera, residents were told it was due to unstable terrain. Those who resisted were forcibly moved by the end of the week. The area around the falls was deserted. Odd light images later showed something strange, heavy machinery surrounding the site, and what appeared to be a large tarp covering the cliff face. After that, nothing more. Months passed. The government eventually reopened Carrera to the public, declaring it safe and fully restored. The waterfall flowed as beautifully as ever, but the rock, where the metallic structure had once been seen, was gun-smoothed over. Sealed by new stone, tourists returned. Vendors rebuilt their stalls, but those who had witnessed the chaos whispered quietly among themselves. The water's roar sounded different now, deeper, echoing, as if the falls were hiding a new voice beneath their eternal song. When asked by a visiting reporter what he believed had truly been found, Emmanuel only smiled faintly and said, "Some doors should never be opened, but once they are, the world must learn to live with what walks through." And from that day onward, Carrera remained both wonder and warning, a place where beauty met mystery, and where the truth, like the water, forever slipped through human hands. While spiritual leaders across continents called it a divine warning, Burundi became the epicenter of the world's fascination and fear. Every nation wanted a piece of Carrera now. Theories multiplied like wildfire. Some said it was evidence of an ancient civilization far older than humanity itself. Others whispered about extraterrestrial contact, about beings who once walked among men. Bet to Emmanuel, it was something simpler and more terrifying. It was alive. In the weeks that followed, the waterfalls took on an unnatural rhythm at night. Their roar pulsed like a heartbeat, syncing eerily with the vibration still lingering in Emmanuel's chest. Animals fled the region. Birds that once nested along the cliffs vanished. Even the air changed thicker, charged with an electric taste, and those who ventured too close to the sealed area began to fall. The government tried to silence it all. Roads were blocked, journalists disappeared, Footage was declared fabricated, though millions had already seen it still. Nothing could contain the spreading unease around the world. People began to dream of the same thing: metallic corridors, endless and echoing, the sound of rushing water, and a voice whispering the same words. Balance must be restored. Emmanuel became a fugitive, hiding in mountain villages with Amani and what remained of Nan's recordings. He aged in days, what should have taken years. His hands shook. His eyes grew hollow, but his resolve hardened. He had seen something no one could deny, something that belonged not to science or faith, but to both. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the mist, Amani spoke softly beside the dying campfire. "The seal was not ours to open," he said, voice trembling, "but now that it is broken, it will choose how the world remembers it." Emmanuel stared toward the horizon, where the roar of Carrera had become a low, steady hum, not fading, not stopping, but calling somewhere beneath the falls, behind layers of metal and time. Something ancient had awakened, and the world, unprepared, divided, and trembling, would soon learn that the secret of Carrera was not about discovery. It was about survival, rented research vessel, and equipment borrowed under false permits. Emmanuel and his team set out under the cover of darkness. The lake stretched before them like liquid metal, calm but watchful. As though aware of their trespass, their sonar scanners glowed softly in the cabin, sending pings into the abyss for hours. The screens showed only the expected contours: ridges, trenches, layers of ancient sediment. Then, just past midnight, something shifted. The sonar blipped once, twice, and then froze. A massive shadow appeared on the monitor, long and curved. Almost organic it was, unlike anything Emmanuel had ever seen. "It's moving," whispered one of the researchers. The shadow pulsed, sending a vibration through the hull of the boat that made the metal-grown instruments flickered. Lights dimmed, and the hum returned, deep and resonant, vibrating through their chests. It wasn't coming from the equipment, it was coming from below. Emmanuel gripped the railing and stared into the black water. The surface began to ripple, the reflection of the moon fracturing into thousands of trembling shards. "Record everything," he said, his voice barely steady. Cameras rolled, hydrophones captured the sound. Not just a hum now, but a pattern, rhythmic and deliberate, like a chant too deep for human throats. Then the lake answered. A column of water erupted upward with such force that it threw the boat sideways. Spray drenched the deck, and the hum became a roar. The team clung to whatever they could grab as waves hammered them from all sides through the chaos. Emmanuel glimpsed something beneath the surface. Not a creature, not exactly, but a structure. Metallic arcs, immense and circular, glowing faintly in the depths. It looked like a ring, or perhaps a gate, half buried in the mud of the lake bed. "Kill the engine," he shouted. The motor sputtered, then died, not by their hand, but as if silenced by the lake itself. The air smelled of ozone and iron. One of the researchers screamed that their depth sensors were reading impossible values. The lake floor was rising before anyone could react. The column of water subsided as suddenly as it had erupted. Silence fell, heavy and unnatural. When dawn broke, the vessel drifted back to shore, half its instruments fried. Emmanuel's team was shaken, some in tears, others refusing to speak at all, but the data survived: the sonar images, the audio of the hum, and one grainy video clip that captured a moment before the surge. A faint silhouette beneath the water, circular and glowing, vast beyond comprehension. Within hours of their return, government agents arrived. Equipment was confiscated, reports erased. Witnesses questioned. Emmanuel was detained for breach of national security. His colleagues were warned into silence, yet, by some miracle, a copy of the recordings was leaked, and once again, Burundi found itself at the center of global hysteria. Scientists debated furiously: was it an ancient structure, a natural formation, something alive? Conspiracy theorists connected it to Carrera, claiming the same hum linked the two phenomena. that both were part of a single buried network stretching beneath the earth in Bujumbura. The people whispered, "The spirits of the deep have awakened." Emmanuel was eventually released, but his life was never the same. He spoke rarely, except to warn those who would listen. "The lake," he said in one interview, before disappearing from public view, "is not a body of water. It is a door, and it has begun to open that night." Fishermen along the southern shore swore they saw faint lights swirling beneath the waves, not reflections, not fireflies, but something vast and purposeful. Moving just out of sight, the hum returned, softer this time, almost like a lullaby. And deep beneath Lake Tanganyika, something ancient stirred once more. By nightfall, the world had seen what Burundi had tried to hide. Clips filmed on shaky phones spread across social media, the geyser of water exploding skyward, the terrified screams, and beneath it all, the impossible sight of vast, moving shapes gliding under the surface of Lake Tanganyika. The footage was grainy, chaotic, but undeniable. Something enormous was alive down there within hours. News outlets from Nairobi to New York were broadcasting the story. Unidentified aquatic phenomenon in Burundi. The headlines blared, scientists debated, governments scrambled, and the internet drowned in speculation. Some claimed the shapes were ancient creatures, disturbed from hibernation. Others insisted they were remnants of forgotten machines, relics of a civilization predating history itself. Conspiracy theorists linked the lake's hum to the metallic chamber beneath the Carrera Falls, calling it proof of an underground network pulsing beneath African Buju. Chaos ruled. The government called for calm, but their silence only deepened. Suspicion. Protesters filled the streets once more, waving banners that read, "Truth beneath the waves," and "The lake belongs to the people." The military sealed off all roads leading to the shore, but it was too late. The truth had already escaped their grasp. Emmanuel became a hunted man to the public. He was a hero, the voice of reason, the man who dared to speak when no one else would. To the authorities, he was a liability. Agents searched for him, his face broadcast as a person of interest. But Emmanuel had gone into hiding, vanishing among the very people who now saw him as a symbol of defiance from safe houses and remote villages. He watched the events unfold. Satellite footage showed the lake glowing faintly at night, its surface pulsing in time with an unseen rhythm. Fishermen whispered that the hum now carried words, faint, incomprehensible, but unmistakably human-like. Elders warned that the ancestors were stirring, that the earth itself was remembering something mankind had long forgotten. And, in the quiet hours before dawn, as the city slept uneasily, Emmanuel sat by a small radio, listening to the hum bleeding faintly through static. Low, rhythmic, and alive, he whispered to himself. "It's not a monster, it's a message." Burundi had opened the door to the unknown, and whatever waited beneath Lake Tanganyika had only just begun to speak. Something beyond human comprehension dwelled within Lake Tanganyika, and now, the world knew. Its satellite images from that night showed patterns, massive circular disturbances spreading from the lake's center. Unlike any known natural phenomenon, seismic sensors across the region recorded rhythmic pulses, steady and deliberate, as though a heartbeat echoed from beneath the earth. Global scientists were divided. Some claimed it was a biological entity of unprecedented scale, while others insisted it was mechanical, a relic of some forgotten civilization, or worse, something not of this planet. Governments scrambled. Borders around the lake were militarized, and naval vessels from neighboring countries patrolled the waters under the guise of joint security operations. UN delegations urged cooperation, but mistrust ran deep. Each nation wanted to claim the discovery, to control it, to weaponize it. What had begun as a mystery had turned into a geopolitical storm. Emmanuel became a hunted man. His speeches had sparked a movement too large to contain, and now both local and foreign agents sought him, some to silence him, others to use him as a symbol. Rumors spread that he had been contacted by those who lived beneath the lake. Conspiracy videos surfaced online, showing doctored clips of him speaking in strange lights, or standing beside alleged underwater entrances. Yet in truth, he was in hiding, moving from village to village, recording everything he could about the events, desperate to preserve the truth before it was rewritten by power weeks. Past the glow from the lake began to fade, replaced by strange stillness. The hum that once shook the ground fell silent. It was as if the entitor, whatever force lay below, had retreated into slumber once more. But silence brought no peace. The people sensed it was not an ending, but a pause awaiting. One night, Emmanuel climbed a hill overlooking Tanganyika. The moon hung low, silver light rippling across the black water. He thought of the thousands displaced by floods, of the cities trembling under fear and greed, of how one mystery had laid bare the soul of his nation, and perhaps the world. The wind carried faint vibrations still, like whispers too deep for words. He pressed his hand to the earth and whispered, "We have heard you. We will listen below, in the depths where light could not reach." Something stirred once more, slow, ancient, where a single pulse rippled through the lake. Faint, but unmistakable. The world might have thought it over, but Emmanuel knew better. Tanganyika had only begun to awaken when Carrera's secret was finally refused to outsiders and placed under local guardianship. The people celebrated, but Emmanuel knew the seal had been broken. The falls remained alive, a faint nightly glow, animals clustering in strange patterns, villagers dreaming of ancestral voices. Nan's photographs circulated as proof. Amani's last words, "Guard the hum," echoed in the valley. The site was sacred again, but the hum beneath Carrera would never fully sleep. Story 4 shifted that tremor from cliff to water lake. Tanganyika, long a source of life and myth, began to answer. Fishermen pulled up dead, iridescent fish. Nights hummed with a sound that set teeth on edge. Boats vanished and returned in pieces. Emmanuel, now dragged from quiet scientist to reluctant whistleblower, led a covert expedition that returned with fried instruments, strange sonar returns, an audio of a deep, deliberate pulse. The state tried to silence him. The people would not be silenced. Tensions boiled into a national crisis. Borders around the lake were militarized. Neighboring states demanded access, and foreign powers circled with offers and threats. Then the lake spoke in light, a blue radiance pulsing across the surface. Captured by phones and satellites, the glow became a global obsession. The government crumbled under leaked documents, and public fury. Protesters toppled corrupt ministers, and in the chaos, a historic pact was forged. The four nations around Tanganyika agreed to protect the lake as a shared sanctuary. The hum never left. The glow returned at times. Scientists, mystics, and elders all offered partial truths. Emmanuel shifted his work, no longer only seeking answers. He made sure local voices shaped research and policy. On the anniversary of the Great Storm, the city gathered by the shore. When the hum rose, they sang with it, not in fear, but in solidarity. And for a moment the lake's voice felt like a mirror of who they had become. Story 5 begins in a damp courtyard under an acacia tree, where Omiji Mujenzi, a griot of the old ways, performs. A story that is more accusation than entertainment. His tale of a greedy king, poisoned rivers, and swallowed palaces hits too close to home. Among the listeners is Emmanuel, a young journalist quietly chasing leads about corruption at the Ministry of Natural Resources. Mujenzi's parable is not fiction, but a coded confession. Villagers recognize their own losses in the metaphors after the performance. Emmanuel pieces together rumors and half-notes. Traveling to remote communities under the pretense of collecting folklore, elders trust him when he mentions they reveal fragments. Families forced from ancestral lands by men in unmarked uniforms. Fishermen who can no longer sell tainted fish. And whole harvests ruined by runoff and poisoned streams. Each testimony fits the pattern. Emmanuel suspected corporate deals, ministerial collusion, and a campaign of silence that has left villages hollowed and hungry. Piece by piece, he gathers the proof, the powerful wanted, buried beneath myth and mud. And as he follows the clues, a dangerous truth emerges. The same hands that seek to exploit the land may also be linked to the very mysteries now waking beneath. Carrera and Tanganyikato see justice through to the end, but his mind knew the cost of defiance in Bujumbura. Truth could make you a legend or a ghost that night. Emmanuel packed a small bag, his camera, a few notebooks, and one of Mujenzi's tiny hand-carved drums, gifted to him with a single word. Remember, he left under the cover of rain, the city lights flickering like dying embers behind him as the bus rumbled toward the border. He looked out the window and saw shadows gathering at the edges of the street soldiers, or perhaps just men paid to silence echoes in exile. Emmanuel's voice grew louder from Nairobi. He continued publishing reports, his words carried by networks that could no longer be censored. The story of the greedy king became a symbol across the continent, a parable of courage, truth, and the price of both. Mugenzi's name, once whispered in markets and village squares, was now spoken in international forums. Activists quoted his metaphors. Journalists adopted his rhythm, but back home, silence returned. The Griot's courtyard was found empty one morning, his drum split cleanly in two beside the fire pit. No one saw who came for him, though everyone knew who had given the order. Yet, in the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Children began to gather in the same courtyard, retelling the story just as Mujenzi had done, each adding a verse, each refusing to forget, and so the legend lived on. Emmanuel once wrote in his final piece, "A story can be killed, but it cannot die. It hides in memory, in rhythm, in the breath between words. One day, when fear sleeps, the drum will sound again and truth will answer." Though the scars of corruption still marked the hills, something in the air had changed forever. The fear that once ruled Bujumbura had thinned, replaced by a quiet, stubborn hope. As dusk deepened, the rhythm of distant drums drifted through the city. Young voices, learning old beats. Emmanuel smiled, his pen resting against the worn pages of his notebook. Mujenzi lifted his drum and struck it once, the sound deep and resonant, echoing across rooftops. "This," the Griot said softly, "is how nations remember." Emmanuel looked out at the flickering lights, at a city that had learned to speak again, and how they begin again, he added. The Griot nodded, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Stories are seeds," he murmured. "They grow, even in poisoned soil." As night fell over Burundi, the two men sat in silence, their shadows stretching long across the courtyard. The writer and the storyteller, guardians of memory. And somewhere beyond the city, a child tapped a rhythm on a tin can, imitating the beat that had once shaken an empire. The drum still spoke, and the world, at last, was listening. Gand, hundreds of farmers echoed in her mind, urging her forward. "If I don't tell it," she thought, "then their struggle dies in darkness." Determined, Neon began publishing her findings piece by piece. Each article peeled back another layer of Kafmontain's deception. Smuggled invoices, falsified reports, and leaked memos implicating senior government officials. The stories spread like wildfire, shared across radio waves, whispered in cafes, printed in pamphlets, passed from hand to hand. Soon, the scandal reached the parliament floor. Opposition leaders demanded an inquiry, while loyalists scrambled to defend the corporation that had long lined their pockets. The Minister of Trade appeared on national television, his voice trembling as he dismissed the reports as fabrications by enemies of progress. But even he could not silence the growing outrage in the hills of Gitega. Farmers staged a strike. They refused to deliver a single cherry to Kafmontain's collection depots. Pickets formed outside warehouses. Women sang protest songs woven from old harvest chants, their melodies fierce and haunting. "You sell our soil," they sang, "but the roots still belong to us." As pressure mounted, Nayan received an encrypted message from an unknown source, insider at Kafmontain. The attachment contained a trove of confidential emails and internal audits, confirming everything she had suspected. and more among them was a letter, signed by a government minister, approving the export of mixed-origin beans under Burundi's name. In exchange for personal kickbacks, it was explosive proof, but publishing it would come at a price that night. As rain drummed against her window, Neon stared at her computer screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She thought of her parents, of Jean's trembling hands, of Am's courage. Then she hit send. The expose went live by morning. Kathmantane's glass towers were surrounded by protesters. International buyers suspended contracts. Global news outlets picked up the story, hailing Nan's investigation as one of the bravest acts of journalism in East Africa. But the victory was bittersweet. Days later, Nan's newspaper office was raided, computers were seized, and her editor detained. She herself narrowly escaped arrest, disappearing into the countryside with the help of farmers she had once interviewed from hiding. She watched as the scandal rippled outward, toppling executives and forcing resignations, mounting international scrutiny. The government announced sweeping reforms in the coffee sector. For the first time in decades, cooperatives were given direct export rights, and Kathmantane's monopoly was dissolved months later, when peace returned to Bujumbura. Neon walked through the coffee fields of her childhood. The cherries glistened in the morning sun, and the air smelled of promise. A group of farmers greeted her with smiles and steaming cups of freshly brewed Arabica. This, one said, handing her the cup, is the taste of freedom. Neon smiled, raising the cup to her lips. The bitterness was still there, but so was the strength in Burundi. They would later say that the story of the beans was not about coffee at all. It was about truth, brewed and shared among those who refused to be silent. From every corner of the countrymen and women who had once felt powerless, now standing shoulder to shoulder beneath makeshift tents and open skies. Their gatherings were filled with songs of defiance and speeches that mixed anger with hope. They stole our beans, AM declared one afternoon to a roaring crowd in Gitega. But they will not steal our voice. By mid-2018, Amakawa Wakuli had grown into a full-fledged movement. Their slogan, "Truth is our harvest," appeared on banners, walls, and even coffee sacks smuggled out to sympathetic buyers abroad. Independent journalists continued to echo their message, though many faced harassment or arrest. Now operating in secrecy, sent her reports through encrypted channels to international outlets that had begun following her story closely. Each publication fanned the flames higher. Then came the turning point. A confidential audit, commissioned quietly by a European trade authority, was leaked to the press. It confirmed what the farmers had claimed all along. Kathmantane had falsified export records, laundered profits through offshore accounts, and bribed officials to maintain its monopoly. The document, thick stamped, and undeniably landed on the desks of international regulators like a thunderclap overnight. The corporation's European partners froze all contracts. Stock prices of Montaigne's parent company plummeted. Weeks later, international headlines confirmed the inevitable. Kathmantaine collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and sanctions. Its CEO fled the country. Several government officials were indicted, though some managed to escape justice. Yet the farmers, the cooperatives, and the people of Burundi stood taller than ever. For the first time, the profits of the harvest began to flow directly into their hands. When Neon finally resurfaced months later, she refused interviews. Instead, she returned quietly to Kaj, where the hills glowed golden under the morning sun. There, among the rows of coffee trees, she met Am once more. "The fight isn't over," he said, handing her a cup of freshly brewed coffee. "No," she replied, smiling faintly, "but at least now it tastes like ours." In the years that followed, people across Burundi would tell the tale of the bitter harvest, how a journalist's pen and a farmer's courage brought down an empire. The story became legend, recited in schools, markets, and songs, not as tragedy, but as triumph, because, in the end, the scandal that nearly broke the nation had also awakened it. Community ceremony in the hills outside Bujumbura. a celebration marking the end of harvest season for Claire and her companions. It was both an honor and a test. The villagers had gathered in a wide clearing surrounded by acacia trees. Their faces glowing in the golden light of dusk fires crackled, and the scent of roasted maize mingled with the faint sweetness of banana beer. When Eugenzi led the group forward, the crowd fell silent. The drummers lifted their sticks, poised over the enomas. Then boom, the first strike shook the air. The rhythm built layer upon layer, until it felt less like music, and more like the earth itself was speaking now. Eugenzi whispered, "You dance not for yourselves, you dance for the drum." Claire stepped into the circle at first. Her movements were hesitant, but then something shifted. The rhythm seemed to pull her from within. Every heartbeat aligning with the pulse of the drums. Leah followed, her energy radiant. Marco's laughter turned into guttural shouts of joy. Even Rio, normally reserved, moved with a quiet intensity that drew cheers from the villagers soon. The boundaries between foreigner and local blurred. Drummers and dancers became one rhythm, one breath. Claire felt tears blur her vision, not of exhaustion, but of belonging. In that moment, she understood what Eugenzi meant. This was not performance, it was communion. When the final beat echoed into silence, the crowd erupted in applause and ululation. Eugenzi smiled, sweat glistening on his brow. "Now you understand," he said softly. "You came to learn a dance, but the dance has learned you." Later that night, as they sat under a vast Burundian sky, Claire wrote in her notebook, "By firelight, in Burundi, the drum is not an instrument, it is a heartbeat. To dance is to speak without words, to remember what the world has forgotten." Rio looked up from his camera and added quietly, "And perhaps, to listen." The fire crackled between them somewhere beyond the hills. Another drum began to play, faint, steady. Eternal resolved quickly. Fear will turn to anger, and once that happens, words cannot calm it. Claire's stomach knotted. The joyous unity of the previous night had shattered, replaced by whispers and wary stares. Marco tried to laugh it off at first. "We've got nothing to do with this," he said, but even he fell silent when he noticed a group of villagers murmuring and pointing in their direction. By afternoon, tension rippled through Giatega. Drums were silent. Children no longer played in the courtyards. Men gathered near the village hall, voices low but urgent. The missing Ngoma had belonged to the founder of Giatega, carved, legend said, from a tree struck by lightning and played only during harvest festivals. It was more than wood and hide. It was the village's soul. Magenzi called the group together beneath a shade tree. "We must help find it," he said firmly, "not to prove innocence, but to honor the trust that was given to you." Rio lowered his camera. "We search where?" he asked quietly. "Everywhere," Mugenzi replied. "The hills, the footpaths, the streams. If the thief is still near, the earth will reveal traces." Claire joined a search party that combed the slopes behind the village. The air was heavy with humidity, cicadas screaming from the brush as they climbed higher. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Footprints led toward a ridge overlooking the valley, one pair small, the other heavier, booted as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in gold. Rio appeared, breathless, waving them over. "You should see this," he said. He led them to a clearing beside an old baobab tree, where broken reeds and bits of red cloth lay scattered, the same cloths that had decorated the drums during the festival. "It was dragged through here," Claire murmured, kneeling to trace the marks in the soil. "But why take it this way?" Mugenzi frowned, scanning the horizon. "Because this path leads to the road. Whoever took it is leaving Giatega." Night fell quickly. The villagers lit torches, forming a line of flickering lights that snaked across the fields. Their chants carried through the darkness, not songs of celebration this time, but of summoning and warning. Just before midnight, a shout broke the silence from the edge of the forest. A figure stumbled into the torchlight, a young man, barely more than a boy, his clothes torn, his hands clutching something wrapped in cloth. The villagers surged forward, shouting when the boy fell to his knees. The bundle rolled free. The missing Ngoma gasps filled the night. Mugenzi pushed through the crowd and lifted the drum gently. His expression, unreadable, the boy trembled as he spoke, his words tumbling out through tears. They paid me. Men from the city. They said no one would notice. The villagers fell silent, fury and sorrow mingling in their eyes. Mujenzi raised his hand for calm. The ancestors have spoken, he said solemnly. Their voice has returned. He turned to Claire and her companions. You see now, he said softly, why we guard the drum with our lives. It is not just sound, it is memory. Claire nodded, her throat tight. Then we must help you keep it safe that night. The ngoma was returned to its rightful place in the village hall. The drums spoke again before dawn, slow, solemn beats that rolled across the hills like a prayer for Claire. The sound no longer simply stirred her, it rooted her hand, though she did not yet know it. The events in Gitega would ripple far beyond that night, into headlines, into policy, into the very debate over who truly owned the heritage of a Nadiante maze of alleyways, swallowed by the chaos he had helped create. When the dust settled, Mujenzi knelt beside the bundle and carefully pulled away the coarse cloth. There it was, the ink, unmarred. Despite its violent journey, he placed both hands upon it. Bowing his head, it has found its way home, he murmured around them. The crowd quieted. The noise of the city faded into a hum, replaced by the steady rhythm of Mujenzi's heartbeat against the drum. Then, slowly, he lifted the mallet and struck it once. The sound was deep, resonant, a call that rolled across the harbor and seemed to shake the air itself. Claire felt tears sting her eyes. Rio lowered his camera, realizing some moments were too sacred to capture. Leah clasped Marco's arm, both speechless, as the villagers began to chant a sound that built, wave after wave, until it drowned out the city's chaos. Mujenzi turned to Claire. Now you understand, he said softly. The drum is not just wood and skin, it is our history, our voice, when it falls silent. So do we. Claire nodded, her voice trembling. Then we'll make sure it never falls silent again. With help from the gathered crowd, the ngoma was carried through the streets like a royal procession. Children ran beside it, singing. Elders walked behind with tears in their eyes. When they reached the bus station at dawn, an old truck waited to take the drum back to Gitagas. The vehicle rumbled away. The morning sun lit the faces of the travelers, exhausted, dirty, but victorious. Claire watched until it disappeared over the horizon, then turned to her companions. We came to learn a dance, she said quietly, and ended up guarding a heartbeat. Rio smiled faintly. Not bad for tourists. Mujenzi's laughter rumbled deep in his chest. You are not tourists anymore, he said. You are part of the story now. And so, as the sun rose over Bujumbura, the tale of the foreigners who saved the sacred drum began its journey, to pass from mouth to mouth, from hill to hill. Some said the ancestors themselves had guided them. Others whispered that the rhythm of the ngoma had chosen who would protect it. Either way, the story would be told, of a people's heritage nearly stolen, and of strangers who refused to let its song die. A tangible, a pressure in the air that no science or reason could explain away. The surface of the lake rippled, though there was no wind now, and a faint mist began to crawl across the water. A storm? Daniel asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice wavered. Jean-Marie shook his head slowly. No storm comes from the middle of the lake, he whispered, only from the mountains. The canoe began to drift on its own, pulled by an unseen force. Sophie's fingers dug into the wooden sides as she felt the current twist beneath them. Then something brushed against the hull, not once, but several times, like hands pushing from below. Yumi gasped. Did you feel that? She whispered, her camera hung forgotten around her neck. Khaled leaned over to peer into the dark water. It's just roots, he said, but his words were hollow, and he didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, Daniel shouted, there! Look! Through the mist ahead, a shape loomed. At first, only a silhouette, then clearer, the wreck of a boat, its frame half submerged, reeds growing through its ribs. It looked ancient, eaten by time and water. Jean-Marie's face turned ashen. That is the fisherman's boat, he murmured, the one that vanished 2 years ago. The air grew colder. Sophie felt it seeping through her clothes, down to her bones, and then she saw them faint. Flickering shapes rising from the lake's surface. Dozens of them. They looked like people, but their forms wavered, as though made of mist and moonlight. Each one held something in its arms. Nets, baskets, tools, relics of a lifelong lost. Ayumi lifted her camera with trembling hands and clicked once. The flash cut through the fog, and when it faded, the figures were closer. "Don't take pictures," Jean-Marie hissed, his voice shaking. "You must not disturb them." But it was too late. The water around them began to churn violently. Waves slapping against the canoe. Khaled grabbed the oar and tried to steady them, but the force beneath the boat was too strong. "We're sinking," Daniel cried. "Hold on," Sophie yelled. Clinging to the side, her eyes darted toward the center of the lake, and there, she thought she saw something massive beneath the surface, glowing faintly blue. It wasn't an animal, it was circular, ancient. "Carved. The lake is swallowing us," Ayumi screamed. Then silence. The wind stopped, the mist lifted. The canoe steadied, as if nothing had happened. They were drifting once more, the reeds parting slowly to reveal the distant shoreline. The shapes were gone. The water was still. Only Jean-Marie's breathing broke the quiet when they finally reached land. He refused payment. His eyes were distant. "Haunted. You must not speak of what you saw," he said firmly. "The lake remembers. The spirits are jealous." But of course, they did speak. Daniel wrote about it in his journal that night, his words trembling across the page. Ayumi developed her photos, and in one of them, faintly visible behind the mist, was the outline of a face watching them from the water. Sophie didn't sleep. She sat by the fire until dawn, staring out at Lake Rohinda, its surface calm once more. But she knew what she'd felt. What she'd seen. The lake might have returned to silence, but beneath that mirror-like surface, something was still awake. Hansen said, "They take our tea, and they take our lives with it." Those words stayed with Patrice long after the meeting ended. He began digging quietly at first, using his contacts in Buj. He obtained copies of shipping manifests and export permits. What he found confirmed the farmers' fears. Containers listed as lost in transit had arrived safely in foreign ports only. Their documentation had been changed, the destination names were falsified, and the tea was being sold under a shell company registered in Dubai. The more Patrice uncovered, the deeper the rot appeared. Senior managers in the export company had ties to the shell firm. Some were funneling profits through offshore accounts, others bribing inspectors to overlook missing shipments. It was an elaborate network, corruption wrapped in the scent of freshly dried leaves. Marie Claire's private records matched Patrice's findings almost perfectly when the two met one evening at a cafe in Bujumbura's city center. They realized they were chasing the same truth. She handed him her notebook, its pages filled with figures, dates, and signatures. "If they find out I shared this," she said, "I'll lose my job, maybe worse." Patrice nodded gravely. "Then we'll make sure it's worth the risk." Over the next weeks, they pieced together a story that revealed not just corporate theft, but a betrayal of the very people who sustained the nation's most important export. They discovered that several government officials had approved the fake contracts in exchange for kickbacks. Even a senior minister's name appeared in one of the hidden accounts. Patrice's article, "The Bitter Leaves of Burundi," finally went public. It sent shockwaves through the country. Farmers flooded radio stations demanding justice. Protesters gathered outside government offices, carrying baskets of tea leaves as symbols of their stolen livelihood. But with truth came danger. Patrice began receiving threats. Anonymous calls warned him to stop digging. One morning, his motorcycle tires were found slashed. Marie Claire was reassigned to a remote regional office for her safety, though she knew it was meant to silence her. The pressure worked. The story had already reached international headlines. European buyers suspended imports pending an investigation, forcing the government's hand within weeks. The managing director of the tea export board was arrested. Auditors uncovered millions in missing funds. As Patrice later wrote in his follow-up report, justice came slowly, Too slowly for the farmers whose lives had already unraveled. Many plantations lay abandoned. The workers gone to seek survival elsewhere. The leaves grow again, he wrote. But trust does not. Marie Claire left Burundi the following year. Taking a job with a transparency organization abroad, Patrice remained, continuing his work despite the risks. Sometimes he returned to Gitega, walking among the tea fields, talking to the farmers who still remembered him. They told him the plants were growing again, but the taste, they said, had changed. The bitterness lingered. He worked on, hoping that routine could ward off the creeping dread. But the rains showed no mercy. By mid, small landslides had begun to slide down the hills, carrying mud, debris, and the fragile harvest into the swollen streams. Emmanuel's maize was submerged, beans floating away from their furrows, and paths that had once connected families now became impassable. Each morning brought a new disaster. Homes partially flooded, storage huts weakened, and the once familiar landscape transformed into a treacherous labyrinth of mud and water. Manuel rose at dawn, inspecting his fields with a mixture of hope and fear. He carried Meyer on his back, while Jonas clutched Claudine's hand as they navigated the slippery slopes. The family worked together, hauling sandbags to reinforce embankments, draining water from trenches, and salvaging whatever crops they could. Neighbors lent hands, forming a fragile chain of solidarity. But the deluge continued, relentless and indiscriminate. By the third week, the village elders called an urgent meeting. They gathered under a makeshift canopy, water dripping from its edges, and spoke in hushed, tense voices. The hills are giving way, one elder warned. We must prepare for the worst. A local engineer had been summoned from Buj, assessing the soil and warning of potential collapses along the main ridge. The villagers, though frightened, set to work on early evacuation plans, marking safer areas closer to the lake's edge, and constructing temporary shelters from tarpaulins and salvaged wood. Emmanuel and Claudine spent sleepless nights alternating between tending to the children and reinforcing their home. They watched as the water cut new channels through the land, carrying away fences, storage bins, and sometimes livestock. Yet even amid the fear, life persisted. Birds adapted, flocks circling higher to avoid floods, while the villagers sang quietly as they worked, a rhythm of resilience against nature's fury. One evening, as the storm raged, Emmanuel stood at the edge of his plot, looking at the swollen streams. He knew that a single misstep could claim his land, his harvest, or worse. But as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the hills, he whispered a vow to his family. We endure, we survive, we rise. Little did they know, the floods of that season would not only test the strength of their land and bodies, but would also reveal acts of courage, selflessness, and unity that would echo through Namarenza. For generations the rains were not merely water, they were a trial, a crucible that would define the village and those who called it home. Beneath them Emmanuel scrambled to the doorway, rain pelting his face, eyes straining through the sheets of water. The ground quaked, sending tremors through the house. Cracks that had been creeping wider now split the soil violently, swallowing paths and fences. A distant roar escalated into a deafening roar, the sound of tons of earth giving way and tumbling downward. Claudine screamed, clutching the children, as Emmanuel gathered what he could: blankets, a small chest of valuables, and the children's favorite toys outside. The village erupted into chaos. Neighbors ran blindly, shouting warnings, carrying children and livestock as best they could. The river of mud and water raced toward the lower terraces, consuming gardens and huts with terrifying speed. Trees snapped like twigs, rocks tumbled, and the wind, whipping with the storm, carried the scream of the hills themselves. So Emmanuel grabbed Claudine's hand, and together with Mira and Jonas, he ran uphill toward a patch of solid ground Pascal had marked weeks before. Behind them, the earth groaned, and the homes they had built with love were swallowed in moments. Some villagers were slower, frozen in shock, calling out 2 missing family members As mud devoured everything, others fought against the tide, forming human chains to drag each other to safety. By the time they reached higher ground, soaked and trembling, the devastation below was clear. Entire fields were gone, homes lay buried under layers of mud, banana groves ripped from their roots, and the lake, swollen beyond recognition, had swallowed the lower path to the village entirely. Yet, amidst the destruction, the villagers clung to one another, forming clusters of safety, sharing water and food salvaged from pockets of debris. Pascal appeared, drenched but steady. "Rallying the survivors, we live," he said firmly. Voice cutting through the storm. "The hills took what they would, but we remained together. We endure." Emmanuel held his children close, breathing in their fear and their warmth. He realized that no matter how devastating the land, the spirit of Nia Morenza would not yield that night. As rain still hammered the earth, the villagers kept vigil, singing quietly, sharing whispered prayers, and tending the injured. The flood had reshaped their world, but it had also forged unbreakable bonds of resilience and solidarity in the days that followed. The rain finally relented, leaving the village in a stunned silence. The hills were scarred, terraces gone, and pathways erased. Yet, despite the destruction, the people of Nia Morenza moved with a determined rhythm, a unity born of shared survival. Manuel and Claudine returned cautiously to their plot of land. What remained of the cassava and bean fields was buried under mud, but neighbors lent hands and tools, forming chains to clear debris and salvage what they could. Children like Myra and Jonas helped, small hands sifting through the soil, carrying stones and broken branches, learning early the resilience their parents embodied. The villagers gathered under Pascal's guidance to rebuild communal spaces. Huts that had collapsed were reconstructed with reinforced earth walls. New terraces were carved carefully into the hillsides to channel future runoff. Food distribution became a coordinated effort, with families sharing rice, beans, and maize while waiting for government and NGO assistance to arrive. Emmanuel felt a new appreciation for the rhythms of the earth. He walked the hills daily, checking for unstable soil, reinforcing walls with stones and wooden supports. Claudine organized a small cooperative, bringing women together to cook and sell what they could salvage, while also tending to those who had lost everything. Even the children played a part, gathering firewood and helping neighbors. Though life was harder, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The flood had taken much, but it had also illuminated the strength of the community's stories of bravery, of neighbors rescuing one another, of children guiding the elderly to safety. Spread across the region, journalists visited, capturing the resilience of the villagers, the way they sang at night to keep fear at bay, the quiet determination in their eyes. Months later, when the hills began to heal and the rains returned in gentler patterns, Nia Morenza had transformed. New terraces, stronger homes, and shared wells marked the recovery. But more importantly, a new sense of vigilance and unity permeated the village. The people had learned to read the whispers of the earth, to respect its power, and to lean on one another when disaster struck. Emmanuel held Mira and Jonas one evening, looking out over the hills now dotted with new growth. "The land is harsh," he said softly, "but it teaches us to endure. We live not just for ourselves, but for each other." Claudine nodded, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. In that moment, the village understood a truth older than any flood. Life could be reclaimed, even after the earth itself seemed to rise against them. The story of Nia Morenza became a lesson passed down through generations, testament to resilience, community, and the quiet strength that rises when people refuse to be broken by the storm. By early 2019, the political climate in Burundi had grown tense. Like a kettle left on the fire too long, the streets of Bujumbura were alive with chatter, demonstrations, and the occasional clash between protesters and security forces. Citizens whispered in markets, schools, and churches, sharing rumors and fears about government corruption, election manipulation, and the growing influence of powerful families in the capital. Among those watching closely was a young lawyer who had returned to Burundi after studying abroad. She had come back determined to fight for justice, yet quickly realized that the law was only as strong as those willing to uphold it. Her small office, tucked between a cafe and a stationery shop, became a hub for concerned citizens seeking advice or a voice for their grievances. One evening, as the orange sun dipped behind the hills, Amina received a visitor schoolteacher named Jean-Claude. His clothes damp from the sudden rain, his eyes were wide with worry. "They've taken him," he whispered. "My brother," he protested. "And now he's gone. No one will say where." Amina felt a cold dread settle in her chest. She had read about disappearances, about ordinary people vanishing after speaking out, but to hear it so close to home made it terrifyingly real. She grabbed her notebook and pen, motioning for Jean-Claude to sit. "Tell me everything," she urged. The man spoke in hurried fragments. His brother, a minor government clerk, had attended a peaceful rally demanding transparency that night. Security forces had stormed his home, leaving behind broken doors and terrified neighbors. No official explanation was ever given. The only clue, a note, left on the floor, with a single word. Silence. Amina realized that fighting this battle required strategy. She began documenting cases of disappearances, collecting testimonies, and connecting with journalists both inside and outside the country. Every report was dangerous. Every meeting could be watched, every phone call intercepted. Yet she pressed forward, driven by the growing chorus of voices demanding accountability. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, officials whispered about the growing unrest. Some feared international scrutiny. Others saw an opportunity to consolidate power. Rumors of rigged elections, manipulated census reports, and shadowy financial dealings circulated among those with access for ordinary citizens. The world felt like a high-stakes game where rules changed with each passing day, and the consequences were deadly. Amina's office became a sanctuary and a trap night after night. She worked by lamplight, connecting families, drafting petitions, and preparing legal challenges. She found allies in unexpected places, retired judges willing to offer advice, community leaders ready to speak in coded language, and a few journalists who risked imprisonment to report the truth. The turning point came when she discovered a ledger showing misappropriated funds intended for rural education programs. Schools had gone unfunded. Children went without textbooks, and teachers remained unpaid. The evidence was concrete, but delivering it safely to international observers required careful planning. In the dead of night, Amina and a small team transported copies, hidden among crates of vegetables, moving quietly through the city streets, avoiding checkpoints and the gaze of security cameras. Every step was fraught with danger, every heartbeat a reminder of the stakes. By the following week, reports began appearing in global news outlets. The story sparked outrage, prompting calls for investigations and sanctions. For the first time in years, ordinary Burundians felt the power of their collective voice amplified across the world. Yet Amina knew the fight was far from over. Change was slow, and the forces resisting it were entrenched in the months that followed. A quiet resilience spread through neighborhoods, communities, organized local councils to monitor schools, distribute resources, and support families affected by disappearances. Young people who had felt powerless began documenting their sharing stories online, and holding forums to educate one another. Standing on a balcony overlooking the city, reflected on the tension between fear and hope. The streets of Bujumbura were still alive with both, but she understood something essential. Courage was contagious, and truth, once revealed, could no longer be buried. The story of the 2019 political struggle in Burundi would not end neatly. There were victories, setbacks, arrests, and exiles, but through it all, ordinary citizens, teachers, lawyers, farmers, and students learned that even in the face of intimidation, the pursuit of justice and transparency could not be silenced. The hills and streets held their whispers, carrying stories of defiance and hope to the next generation. And somewhere, in a small office lit by a single lamp, Amina continued to write, determined that the voices of the silenced would not be forgotten. The southern forests of Burundi were a labyrinth of green, thick with ebony trees, towering ferns, and the tangled roots of centuries-old flora. Travelers rarely ventured here alone. It was the markings carved along its side that froze him, symbols of animals and humans intertwined. A language of legend. The elders of Katumba had long spoken of the Muvumu, spirits that guarded the lake and punished those who disrespected its balance. Nico shivered, remembering his grandmother's words. The lake remembers every hand that takes, every hand that gives. As he leaned closer, his canoe rocked violently. Something beneath the water surged, disturbing the algae and reeds. Nico clutched his paddle. Heart-pounding, a voice echoed from the mist, low and guttural. Words in an ancient dialect he barely recognized. It was neither threat nor welcome, but warning. Nico's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his curiosity anchored him. He noted the carvings, realizing they marked a hidden passage, a shallow channel leading into a cavern beneath the cliffs. Legends spoke of a secret grotto where the lake's spirits stored treasures of knowledge and life, fish stocks that could sustain generations, if only one approached with respect. Over the following days, Nico shared his discovery with a few trusted villagers. Together, they prepared offerings, small fish, maize, and woven reeds, gifts to honor the lake before entering the channel. As they paddled into the mist-shrouded cove, a profound silence enveloped them. The water seemed to hold its breath, ripples frozen mid-motion inside the cavern. The walls glimmered with mineral deposits, reflecting their lanterns in 1,000 dancing lights. Schools of fish swam in crystalline pools, undisturbed by nets or hooks. The villagers understood they had found not just sustenance, but a reminder of the lake's guardianship. Each took only what was needed, leaving the rest, and whispered prayers of thanks echoed in the limestone chamber. When they returned to Katumba, Nico's tale spread quickly. The village celebrated, not with reckless fishing or greed, but with renewed respect for the lake that had protected and provided for them. The secret passage remained, a sacred pact between humans and water, teaching that balance and humility were as vital as courage. Years later, Nico would watch his children paddle out into the lake. Careful and reverent, he would tell them that some treasures are not meant to be taken all at once, that the lake's heartbeat must be honored. And as dawn broke over the water, Nico knew that the lake had chosen its keepers wisely, those who listened, those who remembered, and those who acted with both courage and respect. The highlands of northern Burundi were cloaked in early morning mist, terraces of tea and maize stretching like green ribbons across the hills. Villagers of Rutinga awoke to the usual rooster calls and the faint smell of wood smoke. But that morning, an unease hung heavier than the full. Gold men spoke in low tones of the tremor they had felt just before dawn, a vibration that ran through the earth, subtle but insistent. Most dismissed it as the shifting of soil or the settling of the mountains. But for Nico, a young teacher with an insatiable curiosity, the tremor felt like a warning. She walked the ridge near her home, eyes scanning for cracks or signs of landslide already. Fissures snaked across the soil, shallow at first, but widening with each passing hour. By mid-morning, the villagers noticed something far more alarming. Smoke rose from the slopes of a dormant volcano nearby, a thin ribbon curling into the sky. Rutenga had not seen activity in living memory. Children stopped playing, and adults hurried to reinforce homes, stacking sandbags along the most vulnerable walls. Elderly villagers performed rituals at the base of the volcano, offering cassava, bananas, and prayers to appease the mountain spirits. Nyoka accompanied them, though she had little faith in superstition. Yet, as the day wore on, small tremors returned, now with increasing frequency, making even the sturdiest houses shudder. The village council called an emergency meeting in the open square, the air thick with tension and the scent of damp earth. "We must prepare," said the chief, a stoic man named Taiban. "We do not know the mountain's intentions, Evacuation may become necessary. While most villagers began packing, Nyoka felt a pull to climb higher, toward the ridge. To observe the volcano directly with a small group of able-bodied men, she ascended, keeping a careful eye on the fissures that now hissed with escaping steam as they approached the crater. The air grew warmer, sulfur-laden, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the mountainside, and a small eruption sent ash and pebbles cascading down. The villagers below ran for cover, shouting warnings, while Nyoka and her group scrambled to avoid the debris amid the chaos. Nyoka spotted something remarkable on a ridge above the eruption. A solitary tree stood, untouched, its roots entwined around an outcrop of volcanic rock. It was an ancient fig, gnarled and strong, and somehow it seemed to anchor the mountain itself. Nyoka understood in that instant. The eruption was not just a random disaster, but a message: respect the land, preserve the balance, and work with it rather than against it. Inspired, she shouted down to the villagers, instructing them to clear lower slopes of livestock and fragile structures, while keeping a safe distance but not abandoning the fertile terraces entirely. Over the next 2 days, the volcano's activity fluctuated, ash clouds drifting, small lava flows carving paths through uninhabited slopes. Yet the fig tree and its surrounding ridges remained stable. Villagers, guided by Nyoka and the elders, learned to navigate this new rhythm. Balancing fear with pragmatism, they harvested early crops where possible, moved livestock strategically, and reinforced terraces to redirect potential lava flows into natural gullies. When the volcano finally quieted, the villagers of Rutenga emerged to survey the damage. Some fields were lost, but many terraces had survived thanks to the careful planning and respect for the mountain's warnings. Nyoka's leadership was quietly celebrated. More than that, the village understood a profound lesson. Survival in the highlands required harmony with the earth, an understanding of its moods, and the courage to act wisely when danger came. As the sun set behind the hills, ash still dusting the distant valleys, Nyoka stood by the ancient fig tree. She pressed her hand to its trunk and whispered a promise that the village would